Hey everybody, I thought I would make a video here. I've had some questions lately on Plato and Atlantis, and do I think that was a real account of a real story, or do I think that was myth and fable? And I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I think it was an actual story of a former civilization that got handed down through history by wisdom teachers and mystery schools and stuff like that, and was told to Solon, I believe, and that was relayed to Plato. But I also think he put his own narrative on the story. So I think the foundations of the story are true, but I think Plato, as a lot of ancient philosophers did, they put a moral teaching on the story. And that was true with a lot of ancient writings. When it came to natural disasters, they would put a moral tale onto it and relate the power of their god to the natural cataclysm. I just thought I would say that is a pretty common theme. But can we confirm Plato's story of Atlantis? And by the way, when Plato called it Atlantis, I think that was just a general term he used for an ocean-going civilization that lived on islands in the ocean. And back then, the one world ocean was called the Atlantic. So I think Atlantis was just Plato's way of calling it the oceanic civilization, or the island-dwelling civilization. But let's see if we can confirm Plato's tale through Native American flood tales, and there are many of them. And I'm going to read from Ignatius Donnelly here and his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which was written over 100 years ago when not a lot of information on Atlantis was available. But it says, and I'm going to concentrate on the Indians of the Great Lakes here, because I think we can date when the flood is they are talking about, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. It says, the following tradition was current among Indians of the Great Lakes. In former times, the father of the Indian tribes dwelt towards the rising sun. Having been warned in a dream that a deluge was coming upon the earth, he built a raft on which he saved himself with his family and all the animals. He floated thus for several months. The animals, who at that time spoke, loudly complained and murmured against him. At last a new earth appeared on which he landed with all the animals, who from that time lost the power of speech, as punishment for their murmurs against their deliverer. And going on here, it says, according to Father Charlevoix, and these are people who documented Native American flood myths over 150 years ago, it says the tribes of Canada and the valley of the Mississippi relate in their rude legends that all mankind was destroyed by a flood, and that the good spirit to repeople the earth had changed animals into men. It is to J.S. Cole we owe our acquaintance with the version of the Chippeways, full of grotesque and perplexing touches, in which the man saved from the deluge is called Menabashu. To know if the earth be drying, he sends a bird, the diver, out of his bark, then becomes the restorer of human race and the founder of existing societies. And many Native American flood myths of the northern United States talk of a big canoe, and that is just simply their version of the Ark of Noah in the biblical tale. Now, many of you have probably heard Randall Carlson talk, who are interested in this subject, and he does great videos on the flooding in the American Northwest and the scablands of eastern Washington that was done at the end of the last ice age. Here is ancient Lake Agassiz, and I heard about this when there was cataclysmic flooding in Grand Forks and Fargo in this area here, and it said the flooding pretty much filled up part of ancient Lake Agassiz, and that's when I first heard about this. But this is how big this ancient lake was. And surely if there is a flood myth coming out of Native Americans from northern Minnesota and the Great Lakes region in the Dakotas and Canada, surely it was when this monstrous lake was formed that is larger than all the Great Lakes combined. All right. Now, let's just go over to an article and find out when exactly this lake was created. Now, here is a geological study of ancient glacial Lake Agassiz, and all these are pretty consistent in their information. And this is pretty fascinating. I will leave the link below. It shows a map here. This lake went from halfway up Hudson Bay all the way down to south of the Great Lakes. And they say the water was discharged in a couple cataclysmic episodes. But the information that is most interesting is, when do all these researchers say that ancient Lake Agassiz was created? Well, it says beginning about 11,700 years ago. Now, when does Plato say Atlantis went under? He says 9,000 years before the time of Solon. Solon lived in 600 BC, so that dates at 11,600 years ago. And when doing sedimentation and geological research, going back almost 12,000 years, you have to give a leeway of about 100 years each way. So Plato's date of Atlantis going over perfectly corresponds to the creation of monstrous Lake Agassiz halfway around the world from Plato's world. Is that a coincidence? Can you say that Plato's tale of Atlantis was the flood of Noah, because this is where all the moral stories and the religious aspect of the flood came from, because it was the big flood? Well, you have Native Americans writing the same kind of tale as the biblical tale about a massive flood that certainly had to do with Lake Agassiz, and that flood was dated to 11,700 years ago, the exact same time frame that Plato puts in his tale for the flood of Atlantis. So, is that a coincidence? I don't think you can say that it is a coincidence. I think it is a tale coming from remote history, and the dates correspond perfectly. Hope you thought this was interesting. You have a nice day.